Good, thanks, Greg. Thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. Yes, Rob asked me to put an apology in for his being unavailable. They had a family medical problem. So I'd like to thank Rob for helping me get this organised, and also Kylie Hopkins, who provided a lot of good slides that we've used in some of our extension activities. So, right, why do we feed phosphorus? The three broad things I thought I'd try and cover today is why cattle need P, how we might go about identifying the phosphorus deficiency, and then how we might go about correcting a deficiency with supplements. Basically, phosphorus is one of the most important minerals in any organism. It's essential for all the chemical processes that go on the body of a cow or our body. So it's required for, you know, building bones, making milk, but even more basically about the functioning of your whole digestive system and feed utilisation. And it's often the most important nutritional constraint we face in a lot of grazing country in Northern Australia. And although it's a big challenge, we can economically do a fair bit about it and get better performance over cattle. So sort of a animal nutrition 101 is that the most important things in an animal's diet are energy, protein, and phosphorus. So in the wet season, where the country is phosphorus deficient, we have a situation where the first limiting nutrient is often phosphorus. Then as we move into the dry season, we can get a limitation with regard to protein and energy. And hang on, I'm just having a bit of trouble driving this system. Then other minerals and vitamins, etc., they are important in the animal's diet, but deficiencies of them are very rare in extensive grazing situations. So the message here is the things you have to focus on are energy, protein, and phosphorus, and the critical time for phosphorus is in the wet season. The first big impact that phosphorus deficiency has on cattle is it reduces their intake, their appetite, and consequently their grass intake. And the order of that reduction is typically 10 to 30%. So you can imagine that they're not going to travel very well if they're eating 10 to 30% less feed than they normally would. So in growing animals, that's reflected in reduced growth rates. And in breeder cattle, the impacts flow on from that in terms of animals don't grow as well. So we end up with heifers going into mating at lighter weights, which affects conception rates. Breeders carry less body condition, which then turns around and affects conception rates and mortalities. And at the end of the day, when females get sold out of deficient country, their cull cow weights are lighter because they've spent their whole lives in a nutritionally compromised situation. Very common symptoms that people recognise that occur in association with phosphorus deficiency are obviously bone chewing and also peg leg, where animals have trouble walking because of the effect of the deficiency on their bones and joints, and extreme situations with bone breakages when cattle get handled in crushes, that you can get situations where they might get broken necks or broken shoulders simply because the deficiency has weakened their bones. So how do we go about identifying a P deficiency? There's a range of things we need to consider, and starting with the most basic, that observation and experience is pretty valuable. And cattle behaviour, which is obviously something like bone chewing. If there's a marked difference in performance between paddocks, phosphorus deficiency could be a factor in that. And also local knowledge is an important consideration. Fortunately, nowadays, with better property development and more weaning, that the very gross impacts of phosphorus deficiency, like severe peg leg and broken bones, are a lot less common than they used to be, and a bit of that past knowledge is often very helpful for thinking about, well, maybe there was a problem here and we've reduced it by modern management, but it could still be having an effect on the performance of the cattle. The next thing we can think about is the land types we've got. Obviously, there's a lot of variation between them in fertility, and that flows on to how we might manage them. We've got blood tests, and the most commonly used one is what's called the blood plasma inorganic phosphorus test, and I'll cover that later on. And we also have some ability to look at fecal P levels, but there's a few problems with using that, which I'll cover later on. Soil and pasture testing is often talked about, but there's challenges with that simply because cattle are very selective where they graze. Basically, when they're grazing, they're busy going about trying to find the best quality diet for themselves. And if they've got access to areas of better country in association with very poor country, they can improve their overall diet. So that their selection combined with the variation we see in large paddocks makes very hard to use soil and pasture testing to assess the phosphorus status of cattle. An important resource in Queensland, and I'm not sure about the other states, is that the Long Paddock website, people can access what we call land type reports for the property. So you get a map of the property showing where different land types are, and there's also some excellent information on the characteristics of those land types, and that'll cover soil properties, the type of vegetation, and there's usually some assessment of what the fertility of the soil is like. That's another part of that report coming up there. It gives you an area of those different land types on that property. And when you gain one of those reports, you also get the files that can be used in mapping, so you can start to, if you've got access to some good mapping support, you can start to generate land type by paddock type mapping. Now, with regards to soil phosphorus, it's very important to distinguish whether we're talking about phosphorus for the plant or phosphorus for the animal. So if you've got a soil phosphorus level of under 10, from a point of view of growing a crop or a vegetable, it's pretty ordinary. As you can see on the left here, plants under 10, very low. 10 to 20 parts of phosphorus would be considered low in the world of farming. Whereas when we think about cattle, country that's acutely phosphorus deficient, the soil levels are usually down around 2 or 3 parts per million. Then they get a bit better when we might consider it deficient. And once the soil gets a phosphorus level above about 8, generally we don't have a phosphorus problem. An important thing to note is the type of test we're talking about, and these values are for what's called the Faecal P test, and parts per million is the same as milligrams per kg. It's traditionally the results tended to be expressed in terms of parts per million. Nowadays it's generally milligrams per kg, but often you see both. If you access information on your land types or your soils and it says that phosphorus or the fertility is low, it's definitely worth investigating, but it's important to remember whether we're talking about phosphorus for the plant or phosphorus for the animal. Moving on to animal tests, the blood phosphorus test is considered the best diagnostic in growing cattle. The problem we have with breeder cattle is that they can mobilise significant amount of phosphorus from their tissue and bones. So when a cow starts lactating, if she's on a very low phosphorus diet, she pulls phosphorus out of her tissues and bones to keep herself functioning, maintain milk production for her calf. And then on the flip side, when we wean the calf, and if the diet is of appropriate quality, she's able to put phosphorus back into her body reserves. So that makes interpreting blood tests with breeding cattle quite difficult. The pre-screen test, as we call it, that was first developed in the 1990s, and you can easily get sampling kits, and the laboratory analysis is done from our DAF laboratory, and we can send that information to you later on. You have to bleed about 25 head of cattle, and it's important about that those animals are not supplemented. The actual diagnosis of whether there's a phosphorus issue or not is based on the blood phosphorus levels, and then fecal NIRS or fecal nitrogen are used as a measure of diet quality. Diet quality is important in deciding whether there's a phosphorus problem or not, because the phosphorus requirement increases with diet quality. So we just can't make a judgment on a blood phosphorus level without knowing whether their actual diet overall is good, bad or indifferent. This brings us to the question then, well, if this test isn't terribly good with breeder cattle, how can we handle paddocks where breeders are running? As I said, the issue is that they can mobilise P from tissue and bones as well as putting P back into their tissues and bones. So ways around that are putting a monitor group of animals into the breeder paddock. So you might consider putting 30 steers or spayed heifers into a breeder paddock for the wet season, and we basically then test the growing cattle and use that as an assessment of that breeder paddock. So another option, of course, is maiden heifers, where people put maiden heifers in with older cows. So thinking about the mating season coming up at the end of this year and the summer that's coming up, is that maiden heifers, which would be number 8s if you're a yearling joiner, or number 9s if you're joining at about 2 years of age, they could be a very good target group of animals for testing in 2021 at the end of the growing season. So when to test for P deficiency, because their requirement for phosphorus is highest when the diet has plenty of energy and protein, so that the thing that's holding them back is the phosphorus, we want to test at the end of the growing season. So because of the importance of setting groups up right and getting organised in terms of having the kits ready to go, it does take a little bit of planning. So thinking about 2021 again, some really good target groups might be number 8 and number 9 steers. And as I mentioned before, maiden heifers, number 8s and number 9s could be worth considering, either because they might be running with older cows or they might be running in separate maiden heifer paddocks, and testing could be undertaken to get an idea of what those paddocks are like. Fecal P has been used to estimate diet P, and again, they can't be on supplements. That's also best done at the end of the growing season, when animals have been on a period when diet quality has been good for protein and energy, and potentially the problem they face is phosphorus. The difficulty with using fecal P in breeders is the same as the blood tests, that the breeders have the ability to mobilise phosphorus from their tissues as well as putting it back into tissues. Our conclusion on fecal P at this stage is it's probably a reasonable indication where you've got country that's very good for phosphorus or very low for phosphorus, but that in-between area, it really lacks the ability to discriminate as well as we can achieve with the blood tests. Moving on to supplementation, the things to think about here are when we might feed phosphorus, how much should we feed, how to go about doing it, and then the likely cost of this and how you might choose particular products. So the wet season is when we're going to get the best response, because that's when phosphorus is likely to be limiting in the diet. The challenge, of course, with wet season supplementation is protecting lick from rain and getting it out under boggy conditions. During the dry season, if you've got breeders lactating and they're running on phosphorus deficient country, they still need phosphorus, and that's why it's always recommended to include phosphorus when you're putting out a dry season lick on deficient country. With dry cattle, say growing cattle, they show very little response to phosphorus if they're losing weight or just maintaining weight. But the breeders, they definitely need it in the dry season. How much to feed? This table's a part of a larger table that's in the MLA 2012 phosphorus manual. And just as examples here, I've highlighted in red a couple of examples. So if we had 200 kilo steers or heifers, which in the wet season we thought they had the potential to do, say, 0.6 of a kilo a day, and they were running on deficient country, the target for feeding them phosphorus would be 4 grams a day. If we think about a breeder, say 400 odd kilos, probably only maintaining her weight because she's lactating on acutely deficient country, we'd be trying to supplement her with about 9 grams of phosphorus a day. So that table that's in that manual, and you can get either the manual from your local extension officer or MLA, we can help you interpret that when we want to think about how much supplement you might have to get into your particular groups of cattle. Ways to do it. Loose licks are the cheapest way to do it, and they also offer the flexibility that you can tailor the mix to suit your cattle, your country, to get the intake right. The problem, of course, is you need shelters over them in the wet, and that's just an example of how someone's done it with, you know, a tin roof over old loader tyres being used as the trough. Another method some people use, where they don't want to go to the trouble of building any shelters, is they put it out in bulker bags and they add about 5% limestone to help harden it. That seems to make it reasonably weather resistant. You know, it might be considered a bit rough and ready, but if it's a choice between not getting phosphorus into them and getting phosphorus into them by this means, well, you're better off giving something a go. The bulker bags are pretty convenient, but you do need something to lift them with, of course. Blocks are very good because they're weather resistant. You can easily drop a heap of them around before the wet, but they do have a higher cost per unit of P. And the other issue that comes with blocks is they're basically a fixed recipe, and you have really no ability to alter the composition to get the intake required if you have an intake issue on your particular property. And we often see situations where block intakes are below what we really want, and there's not a lot you can do about it. So a few more points about lick composition. Most of our licks are a blend of mono and dicalcium phosphate blends, or a dicalcium phosphate product. Salt's usually added as an attractant, or in some country it limits intake. If intake's a difficulty, protein meal can be added to make the whole thing more attractive. But the aim of the exercise is to feed as little attractant as possible so that we maximise the phosphorus content of the lick, which means that there's less material to be handled and the cost of it will be lower. With our dry season licks, the composition is adjusted. That is how much DCP or monodicalcium phosphate we put in. We adjust the composition of that based on the lick intake and how much phosphorus we need to get into them. So a pretty common thing is that a dry season lick for cattle on phosphorus deficient country will have somewhere between 10 and 20% either dicalcium phosphate or a monodicalcium phosphate type product. This table I've got here is just a few indicative costings, and I think the main thing to note here is that the higher the phosphorus percentage, the lower the cost per head per month. So these figures are based on supplying 9 grams of phosphorus a head a day, which might be what we would need to get into a lactating cow in very deficient country. So this brew here, which is an MDC with salt, 15.9%, they only have to eat 57 grams a day. If you had something that's only 6% phosphorus, although it might be cheaper per tonne, the intake is virtually treble and the cost is considerably higher. And just a couple of examples with blocks, that the higher the phosphorus percentage in the block, the lower the cost it's going to be. So as with any supplementation activity, it's all about understanding what you have to feed and trying to do it at the lowest possible cost. And that generally means not including things they don't really need. It's important to think about how we manage the supplement, particularly if you're starting out new with wet season phosphorus supplementation, you've got to be prepared to experiment with the composition to find out what your cattle like on your country. And an important part of that is having good records. Unless you've got some records, it's impossible to work out how much phosphorus, or for that matter, protein, you're getting into them, say as regards dry season feeding. And with that information, you can then start to think, well, do we need to change this? How much is it costing me? Is there a better way to do it or not? And finally, I'd just like to highlight that while supplements can make a big difference to how cattle perform, we can't forget about a few of the basics like stocking rates, because the way phosphorus works, or for that matter, dry season supplementation works, is it enables them to eat more grass. And unless the grass is there, you're not going to get the result. Weaning is super critical with managing phosphorus, because you might have noticed on those tables the difference in phosphorus required by a pregnant cow versus a wet cow. It's basically lactating cow needs double the phosphorus of a dry cow. And also disease control. If we manage our nutrition well, we don't want to be brought unstuck by having a disease control problem. So on that note, I'll conclude with and take any questions.